Welcome to the story of us, living with chronic illnesses while loving, thriving, and making our way through this thing called life. This is Love Chronically. Hello, and welcome back. This
Welcome
is
back.
Keely and Danielle, and we are talking about grief today in episode 2.
Yes, we're back. We made it back. Talking about grief in episode 2. What type of grief are we talking about?
We're talking about just the grief that comes with a diagnosis of chronic illness, but I think the ongoing grief that comes up, right? Because I feel like we were fed a lie at some point. We've
hmm
got this really great stages of grief, and we try to, whether it's a person that we lose or, some situational thing that happens, we will usually kind of try to go through and check those boxes off. And that's not really how grief works. For folks that have chronic illnesses, it feels like there are baby losses. Sometimes there are major losses initially,
hmm
but it's still grief that happens and we don't talk about it. I talk often about how, we have a death phobic society, but I really feel like it's more of a grief phobic society where we don't really understand or admit when there's an issue, and we really don't talk about our feelings as it comes to losses, and especially with any illness that we might have, because we do lose things. There are things that get lost along the way, right?
Yeah, especially dealing with Parkinson's. Coming to terms with dealing with the fact that there's some things I'm not going to be able to do. I know physical therapy works or helps, right? But just not being able to do things the way you're used to doing them sometimes it feels kind of unfair. It's like, because you're getting old anyway, right?
Right.
So you're gonna lose certain things anyway, and then the universe hits you with this. It does kind of stings, at first, and you always processing that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And I think it's like stages, right? Because sometimes you don't process the first part of it and then it just hits you later. I always talk about how it comes in stages, and it will happen during some life events. It could happen during, special times, or when you start to realize that, things aren't working like they used to, or you're
hmm
having more and more issues. So it's an ongoing thing, and it's something, like I said, that we don't talk about. And I think there's, again, we started talking about vulnerability when the last episode, but I think it has a lot to do with that, being vulnerable and understanding that there are things that are not going to be done, feeling like you have to explain it, or like you need to give, you know some type of excuse for it. I think that there are a lot of layers to grief and how it shows up.
Yeah, especially those activities that are very vulnerable, like maybe like sex or dancing, or maybe you once were able to do certain things and now you have to have a conversation. You know, how does that look? Or what does that look like going forward?
Right.
And that can be challenging, you know.
I think, I mean, we'll discuss, we actually have an episode about sex coming up. Stay tuned for that. So
Let's talk
that's I
about
think
sex,
a
baby.
big one.
Let's talk about
We're not singing the theme song. We're not going to do it.
showing my age right now, sorry.
But, I think other things and other activities that come up. But like you said, it's the idea of making sure that we're talking about it and making sure that we are bringing it up. But how do you bring it up? And then what is it, right? What does it look like to have grief? And how does it show up? Because oftentimes grief doesn't show up the way that we expect it.
Right. Because when we started talking about this episode, when I think about grief, I think about like death.
Hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like I think about someone's passed away and I never really, you know, put the two together. Like I'm grieving some of these activities or abilities or even even like for me, I like to write, right? So I used to be able to type fast. So now, I might not write as much. I might have to do speech to text. It's frustrating, but I didn't realize it was kind of grief that I'm going through. If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And it comes up like sometimes I feel funny typing around you because many times, every time that you hear me type, you mourn
You
your
feel that?
inability to type that fast, right?
Is it that obvious?
It is.
I'm
It is,
sorry,
babe.
babe.
It is. I like you talk about it, and it's one of those things where if I'm on the phone with you and I'm typing and you hear it, you'll make a comment, and it seems like it's a comment in passing, but
Aw.
after 2 years, you realize that it's not a comment in passing, that it is affecting you. So then the question is, okay, so what can we do about it? And this is where I think it helps to be vulnerable, and then you know, like what can we do about it? Physically, that might not be a possibility, but what does it look like for you to get help? For example, what does it look like for you to, you said text to speech? Is that working for you? Do we need to get a new thing that works, an app, right? I think
Hmm.
the other thing on the other side of this is we have so much technology that can help us at this point.
Right.
So it's nice to have some of those aids, but ultimately we need to be able to say, okay, this is where we are. And yes, sit with it. You have to mourn it. Otherwise, it keeps coming back up. And then, what do we do about it? Can we do something about it? Because there are going to be things, right, that we won't be able to do anything about moving forward. But as long as we can look at some of the things that we can do, then, we can
You
step in
know,
and do something.
a lot of it I'm realizing is ego too, because I was one of those guys, I get an email, I'm like, oh yeah, roll my sleeve up. And I'm typing really loud too, like I was that guy. But a lot of it is ego, and really taming the ego to realize this is a new reality that we're dealing with or that I'm dealing with, and sometimes I forget,
You forget. So I think it's interesting that you brought up ego because I do think a lot of the things that I think the thing that burns off the quickest if you allow it, right? It's ego when you're ill. But we also don't realize until we're there how often ego has been driving it, right? When ego has been driving, in the driver's seat for certain things and certain things that we do that might be ego driven that now we got to go back and be like, I can't do that anymore. So what does it look like for you moving forward if you can't do that?
well, I'm still killing these kids on the court, so sometimes. Except from pickleball, I don't know what happened there. I thought I had that down till there was an incident.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about this because this bothered me so much.
Wait, talk about what?
The pickleball incident.
I mean, we can touch on it. We don't got to go into depth.
We don't, but what I'm saying is like that was a good example of ego, right? You're used to doing this thing, you're going to do it, you're going to go ahead and, beat up on the old people on the pickleball court.
In my defense, if this lady was competitive, it wouldn't have got there.
What lady?
The older woman.
So you're blaming the old lady. Okay,
No, no,
gotcha.
no, 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 no. They were killing us, and I turned to her. I said, "Listen, hey, listen, it's 10-0. What's up? We got to step our game up." And she's like, "Oh, I'm just out here for the calories and exercise." And my son is on the other side laughing at me, and I was like, "All right, I got this. I'm gonna pull a Kobe. I'm gonna come back." And then I tripped.
And then you trip
I fell.
and then you fell. And so on the other side of it is me who like this is you're always going and you're not always thinking about this again, ego thing, right? You're like, I can do it, whatever the case might be, but literally that was my fear. And so that was just it's hard to hear on the other side because I know that you have to kind of go through your process, but there's a grief on the partner side too about what you can and can't do. And on top of that, a safety concern. I have a huge safety concern when you're out playing because of stuff like this, right? Like we know that can happen. And it can happen to anyone, right? It's not that it can't. You can trip. Anyone can trip. Anyone can, you're playing ball, something happens, but there's always that additional. layer for you, at least from my perspective, to make sure that you're safe and that you're like intact, because there are so many other mobility issues that come with Parkinson's.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I still think if she put a little bit of effort in, it would have been a lot closer. A lot closer.
Okay, you're blaming the lady. All right.
I'm not blaming
So
her, but
I
I
feel like maybe you need to like either we don't go out and play with people that are just there to have fun. That's the first thing, because obviously you have a problem with that. You're gonna want to go in there and be competitive, but I also feel like tempering that competitiveness. What does that look like? And that is
no, I agree
something
with
that
that
you might have to
because
warn.
I did run over to her side to hit the ball, so I kind of I kind of see
So I think it's interesting
that.
that I'm getting the whole story
I didn't tell
now.
you that before.
No, 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 you didn't tell me any of
Yo,
this. You didn't tell me that it was that the lady.
her husband is like a guru. He looks old, but but he's tricky. He set me
Okay.
up right. So because he picked my son and like he has me running all over the place. He knew what he was doing, and I felt like it was a setup. And then for her to be like, oh, I'm just here for the exercise. You know what I'm saying? You know. So
So we're gonna have to work that out in therapy because there was a lot. You have a lot of feelings
all right,
towards
I have to.
towards that
Sorry,
couple
guys. I don't know
and
how
the
to take
guy.
offense to it.
We're gonna put a pin on that, y'all, and we're gonna, come back to that. Come back to that. Things like that, right? Like, and we can talk about it, and it can be. We can joke about these things, but I think at the end of the day, when you're sitting down and you're thinking about what you could or couldn't do that day, it does get to you. Sometimes, these things get to you, right? So it's a matter of being able to talk about it and being able to figure out how to process it.
Yeah. I think knowing what you were able to do at some point and what you can do now and making those two realities meet, I think that's where the work comes in. And like you said, you can't beat yourself up.
Right. And it's like the idea of ambiguous loss around chronic illness,
Hmm.
right? Because it's an ongoing cycle of mourning. Because sometimes it's not anything specific, and sometimes it is, and it really depends, but it comes up, it keeps coming up. I know for me, certainly in the last year, it's been very much like a physical thing of being able to do stuff,
Right.
being fatigued, being tired, being in pain. But before then, the biggest, I think, thing that I had to get over was not being able to have more kids. And so that's not a little thing.
I know.
And I tell folks all the time, I feel super lucky that I have my daughter. When I was diagnosed, at that time, I was diagnosed at stage 3 endometriosis. And the one thing that I remember like sticking in my head was the doctor saying that the chances for me getting pregnant at that time were like 60%. And then it was like, it'll go down every year after. Surprise! And so that was a huge thing, and I didn't at that time. I was 26 when I was diagnosed. I just thought, okay, well then I might not, right? I might not be able to have children. And then I did. And then, I had to have more surgeries after because the endo was flaring up again. And so it's like all of these things happening. And then you have to make the decision, right? At different stages, you have to make decisions because also, as much as I might want to, the idea of making a baby by myself was not appealing. So it was that, right? All other things that you have to you have to take into account, but it was hard, the possibility of not being able to. And then in 2018, when I had one of my surgeries, it was like, okay, maybe I'll try. Maybe we'll see where we are. I wasn't ready to let go of that idea yet, which I probably should have been. And it wasn't until this year, obviously, I mean, like 100 years old, I don't want to have any babies right now. But, you know, it was just the idea of being able to let go of that part of me that would never have the possibility. And while sometimes it's like, oh, great, I don't have the possibility again. I think for women, especially because I've spoken to other women who either have, health issues or who have endo and have had to have a hysterectomy. It's like, it's one thing for you to not want to have a baby. It's another thing for you to not be able to, right? So those
The
things,
finality.
the finality of it.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing. Some of that
Sure.
stuff this first time I've ever heard it put that way. I'm thankful that I have this support system that I have because some of the stuff I found out I couldn't do on the whim. For example, when I came down to Florida, I was just hanging out. I went to the Heat Ice Bar, Flame Lounge, or whatever it's called. Someone asked me to dance, and I I grew up dancing. I was like, oh sure. When I got out there, couldn't I couldn't move, and I kind of panicked. It was the first time. It's the first time that's happened to me, and I was like, oh my god, what the hell's going on? At that point, I wasn't taking my medication either, but that's when I found out I couldn't move a certain way. It was weird. It was weird to process. And then as far as when I started typing, it was one day I just couldn't type the way I could type. The body finds a way. I'm ambidextrous, so like I use the mouse on my left, thank God. But what if I wasn't? It'd be kind of tough.
I mean, I think that's where you come into finding certain aids, finding certain tools that will help. But I think too, like having that information, then this goes back to the idea of making sure that you have a team and why you have a team, right? Because it's the idea
Right.
of when you go to your therapist and say, hey, like that might be a goal. The goal might be I want to be able to dance in 6 months, right? Like, or whatever that looks like. It's really being able to add something in and being able to have the discussion. But I think that a lot of people don't have the discussion around the pain or pain levels that they're feeling because they don't want to seem weak. Or
You mean they don't talk to the health professionals about it, or
I think they
they're
don't,
in general?
I think in general, and I think it's a both and, right? I think people don't talk about it with their providers and then maybe don't have a team to talk about it or don't talk about it with their family and friends. I remember when my mom was sick, I started noticing some issues, and finally she agreed to go in and speak to a therapist, which was huge. I was always my mom's interpreter. So it was interesting because I told her, I was like, I am not going to go in here and interpret for you. I'm actually going to get someone if we don't have a Spanish speaking therapist to speak to you. And what came out of that was the fact that she had pain induced depression because she'd been in pain for a long time, but had not told anyone. So her pain wasn't being managed because she wasn't talking about it. Right. And so it's the idea of what we disclose or feeling like it's okay and you can take care of it and you can handle it,
Yeah, I pushed through.
and I tell folks all the time, even if you are going to, even if you have the solution, like even if I know that I'm taking herbs for sleep here or whatever, right? I'm going to let my doctor know that, hey, I'm having these symptoms because it could be something else, or they need to track what's happening as we move forward with, different type of treatments or things like that. So it's important for you to talk to people, but also you have to make sure you have the right people around you, right? Because I think sometimes if we don't have healthy, healing people around us, it's going to be difficult to have some of these conversations. But it's also why, again, we go back to making sure you have a team in place.
Yeah, and I remember when I started doing the physical therapy. I told you, I told the therapist things I wanted to kind of improve on, but I didn't talk about sex with her. And you were like, why not? What? So you see, this is why I got to go down there with you. And I was like,
We want to be able to get him into this position. Can you make that
you know
happen?
what I'm saying? I was like, man, because I was like, how do I bring this up to this woman? And I'm like, you know, and then
That's her job.
and then the next time one day I was like, yeah, and I also want to be able to do, you know what I'm saying? And dance and like dancing motions and flexibility. I was trying to kind of like explain to her, but I didn't really go into detail into like you know
Well,
I
that's
want to
hard.
I want to be able to be doing like this with my wife, my girl. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy just to sit up there and have that intimate conversation with a total stranger.
I mean, it's not easy, but that's her job. And if she doesn't, and if she's not open and responsive to it, then you need a different therapist. Like really, that's really kind of what it comes down to. As we move forward and there are more things that change, right? It's important for you to know the things that can make things a little bit better, that can, kind of help you get through all the other mess, right? I know you and I have talked about this. I had all kinds of pain in the last year. And my biggest fear was not being able to have sex, not wanting to, or having some, pain issues and all of that. Uh, and it happened, right? And my thing was, I'm going to be in pain anyway. So I'm going to be in pain anyway. I am not giving up orgasms because of a little pain, right? And I'm going to say that,
Amen.
and that's just what it is.
Preaching to the
But that
choir.
was really what I thought about, and how I thought about it and how I processed it in therapy. Like we had this discussion around like this is the thing, like
Hmm.
and here's some of the things that are happening. And I talked to my doctor about it. Like, yes, I am having, I'm having pain when I orgasm. That's a problem. But I'm also not going to give it up. So let's talk about it, right? Like, and we had a really constructive discussion about it, but it also allowed her to see where I was. It allowed her to kind of gauge some of the other things because we'd had some progression in the disease in the last year and a half. So again, all things that you should talk about. I probably talk about a lot of things that my therapists and my whole team thinks is unhinged. I don't care. This is what it is.
What did the doctor tell you? He said have have sex, but don't be too freaky.
Yeah, just take it easy. It's all right. Just
Don't overdo it.
don't overdo it. And don't call her if I pull something. I mean, I should call her if I pull something, but it's fine. But yeah, it's just things like that where we're not talking about it and then having the discussion because yes, it is. It can be upsetting when you find out that you can't do, and especially things like sex is the big one, right? That everyone kind of talks about with endo. I've heard so many people that just aren't able to. Things are painful, and it's just you don't feel sexy when you're in pain. You don't like all of these things, right? That affect you know sex is it's mental. A good part of sex is mental, whether you want to admit to it or not. Which is why I think it's important to have the discussion. And it looks different, and it might you might have to switch some things up and all of that, but that's why it's important to have the conversation because otherwise you're going to be in the middle of the dance floor panicked instead of being able to do what you can do and have fun while you're doing it because you talked about it and you were able to work some things out.
Yeah, I was reading something earlier. It talks about it's. I'm sorry, I just got a interesting text from the school. The thinking about it, the anxiety does lead to other mental factors, right? That just affect everything. Especially if you're in a relationship and this is the first time you're dealing with it. I think. What if I was younger? I don't know if I would have handled it the same. As I'm handling it now. You know, um, just being in a relationship and having this, if you're the only one who knows about it, or you're the only one who's really vested in it, it just, just looking back, I'm not sure where I'm going with it, but, you know,
I think it's a different being in a different state of mind. I think it's age related, but I also think it's just what happens when you get diagnosed with something like early onset Parkinson's, right? Like your brain doesn't
hmm
have a choice but to adjust to that. So that's a big part of it. But it's also part of the grief. And again, this is why it's ongoing because new things pop up. And then how do you deal with it? And where's like where do you land? Where do you land with it as you're going through it? And then
well, sorry to cut you off. I'm thinking about grief in the sense that, like now that I know what endo is, right? I'm looking back and looking at situations where I may know people who have endo, right? And I have a lot more knowledge now about what it is, how it affects the body, and I'm thinking about like, wow, no one really talks about it. No one really knows what it is when I bring it up. So I can just imagine having it, being in a relationship, like you said, being in pain, being in, you know, and then dealing with the relationship problems is just you know.
It's mounting. It's the dealing with it, it's the having to explain it, it's the
Right.
continual having to, like, literally it feels like you're having to, like, lay your guts on the table every time, right? And so for people to see, so it's a very vulnerable state. But then after a while, you do get angry, you do get upset. Again, and as we talk about the stages of grief that we've all known, that I happen to think are, that's a whole story. My thoughts on grief are the whole story, but
I don't have the stages if you want to lay them out, not too
you don't
much
have the
about
stages. What was it? It's like stages of grief: denial, anger,
it. Mm.
denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And
Mm.
we were given this, what, in the 70s, right? We're given this nice little list that we could just check off. And it's bullshit, because it's very much the way that that was explained to me
Denial.
when I was going through, yeah, through grief counseling, was it's really like peaks and valleys, right? So you actually fall into denial or anger, and then you're back up and you feel good, and then it's, like, it's all of these, it's not linear, it doesn't happen in that order, and it doesn't just happen once, right? The reality is that grief is non-linear, and at every stage there's going to be a level of grief. A big part
What do you
of the
mean by that? It's non-linear.
it's not, you're not gonna, like, you're not just in denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance and then you're done. Like, it doesn't fall
Gotcha.
that beautifully, right?
Gotcha.
It doesn't. We're humans, and that's just not how it works. Some people would say that that's, and there's been a lot of back and forth about whether or not that's even an acceptable, framing of grief,
Hmm.
because it's so circular and there's so much that goes back and forth. And every time that there's a holiday, something comes up if you've lost someone. And sometimes it's not just the holiday, sometimes it's a special day for you, a birthday, a special event, an anniversary. And all of that comes right back up, or can come right back up, because grief is not linear. So when all that happens, we are fed a load of bullshit in grief. And then, of course, a lot of us apply that to when we're talking about death. But then as we are grieving other things, I mean, and you can grieve a loss of a job,
Yeah.
a relationship, changing schools, like all of these things, right? Bring with it some level of grief. And so the idea is, how do we move in? How do we move out of that? And then talking about all the different ways that this touches us, because it's hard, and you have, physical limitations that maybe you've been dealing with for a long time, but now it's getting worse. Or today I just don't feel great and I had all these plans, and now I have to cancel all my plans because I don't feel good. And then I feel bad because, I don't want to have to tell my friends one more time that I can't go somewhere because,
Yep.
and well, what is it? And it's like, well, I have this pain. But then it's like, well, I thought you had surgery. Why isn't this done? And it's like, now do you have the energy to talk about, this issue that's affecting you because of how the muscular system works and adhesions? Like, you don't. So there's a lot of grief, and it's revolving, and it comes back up. And then also, if we have partners that are not understanding,
Right.
then that's when we get into a lot of reasons, a lot of people that, do find themselves separating, because of the heaviness of some of the issues that come up when you're dealing with someone that's chronically
Hmm. Hmm.
ill. Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting that you've had this experience. Well, I think you probably, in my opinion, had more experience with grief than I have. I can't imagine what it would be losing a parent. I know it's going to happen one day, but it's, and many of my friends have been through it. And, the only grief I had up until recently, up until my grandmother passed, that was deep for me, but it's not the same as like a mom or dad that you're close to. So I guess I'm saying I never really had to deal with a lot of grief or big grief in my life. So now, like, learning how to process this change, it's different. It's
Right.
different. And like you said, some days are good, some days are bad. Some days I'm still back at step one in denial, even though I took the test. Some days you'd be like, well, you know, I have melanin. That counts for something. Maybe, you know, maybe I'm being delusional, but like you said, that's all part of the cycle, you know,
It is.
which
It is.
I just realized just now.
And yeah, and I think part of it too is, I mean, I will say that you're really good about like accepting it and hearing it, but that was very apparent when we first met, that I often wondered if you understood the extent of your own disease because of how what you were saying, but also what you weren't saying. And so that's part of the reason why we would have these like really low ball conversations around Parkinson's. Very much not around you specifically, but I think around illness in general.
Hmm.
And then I think it helped because I would talk about what I was going through, and that kind of helped you sometimes talk about some things. Whereas if I would bring something up directly, you might not talk about it, or you might just say you're fine, or move on. Like I had to learn, I could not ask you if you had pain overnight, um, or anything related to that. If you notice, I ask you if you had any discomfort. You respond better to the word discomfort than you do to the word pain.
Really? I didn't
Yes.
keep that. I know you're
Yes.
doing a case study. What
Well, yeah.
what happened now?
Sometimes you don't react. Like if I'm asking you about something, if I'm asking you about being pain, and if I'm asking you about something physical, right? Because I
Hmm.
know that there are physical things that happen whether you want to admit to it or not, because that's just what your body is doing because of the disease,
Hmm.
that you might not, I would have to ask you two or three different times in different ways. So now what I do is I just ask you if you had any discomfort overnight, and you will be more open to tell me yes, like you were having a problem with your arm or your leg, or it's like something like that,
Hmm.
which is also the reason I kept asking you, was because I was trying to figure out what we could do for it, because I know you're not researching what to do with it, right? You're just kind of moving along your day like a man, and you're just going about it. And it was like, okay, well, if this is happening, then how can we fix it? That's how we ended up with the weighted blanket, right?
Right.
Because then when I started asking you some things, you were saying there's discomfort. You said, I remember you specifically said it felt like your arm had anxiety or something like that. You used like a very like it was very visual way that to describe it.
Hmm.
And so then it was like, okay, well, then let's experiment on what would help with that. Right. So oftentimes is the wording, but oftentimes I think too, it's sitting in denial for a long time because it's such a hard, big thing to accept.
Yeah, I agree. And you know what? And sometimes you don't know what you don't know. Like I wouldn't, in my brain, would have never have conceived the weighted blanket, you know. And what it does is it's heavy enough where it kind of holds, it's like a big hug. It kind of holds the arm, you know, as if someone's hugging you or holding you down, right? And it just brings peace, you know. So I was like, wow, this little simple gadget, you know, can bring so much comfort.
Yeah. And that's relief because of the way that your body, part of the problem is that the reason why you had that discomfort was it's overnight, your muscles are still firing.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it. Again, you have to know, part of it too is like you have to know what is happening, what the disease is bringing, so that you can figure out how to battle it. And I think oftentimes people stop at the diagnosis because they don't want to take a look and see where they're going to be, or what this might look like moving forward. So, and there's grief there, right? There's grief there, and there are things that, part of it is being able to have the discussion today and talk about what this looks like and what you want it to look like, knowing that there might be some things later on, but also understanding that there will probably be some other weighted blankets in the future to help with whatever comes up.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The future, you know, no one has a crystal ball, right? You really don't know what medical technology is going to be invented or presented with. But until something comes out, you really don't know what it looks like, you know, or how long you have to be at least functional the way you used to being functional. And I definitely think that can cause anxiety and grief, you know, but the last the last 2 years, I would say just about the last 2 years, that I haven't thought about that as much. You know, I used to think about, damn, you know, I'm in my 40s now. By the time I'm in my 60s, da da da, and it'd bring tears to my eyes. And, I really, I guess I really focus on more like enjoy the moment. You know what I mean? One moment leads to another moment. Another moment leads to a day that turns to a week. And all of a sudden you just enjoy the last month, and you haven't had those doom and gloom thoughts.
I mean, I think it's natural to have those doom and gloom thoughts. And I think it's actually important to process them because a big part of it is when people don't, when people are sitting in grief and not allowing themselves to see the grief for what it is, right?
Hmm.
And being able to give themselves permission to grieve because that's the other thing too. I would always say, well, I have it good, right? And I have it good because I know that there are other people with endo that have it way worse.
Right. Me too. Yeah.
But that also that doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel right because I still have this thing. I still have this condition and there are limitations and there are days where I'm in the bed crying, right? It's just what it is. And it's not a comparison game. It's just how do I feel today and allowing myself the time to have that moment of grief or that moment
Hmm.
of thinking through it, being sad, right? About the things that you lose and about the things that you never get to while at the same time feeling support. And so then I can just have the discussion right in therapy like, hey, I had a really hard day and this is why, and being able to process through and finding also the coping skills, right? So we talk about that, we
Coping
talked about
skills.
like
Yeah.
like the stages and the triggers, and it could be anything. It could be figuring out that you can't do something, or it could be a special moment that is going to pass you by because you're not able to deal with it or you can't go to where you need to go. But then it's like, what are the coping strategies for that? I think talking about it is always my first place, having a safe space where you can have a discussion. So whether
Hmm.
it's a peer group, whether it's a partner, and I know though that there are times when that's not an option, right? um, a therapist, your doctor, like all of these places, and it goes right back to making sure that you have that team support. And that does include peer groups. That does include, like, I know I'm always harassing you about, like the Fox Foundation has these great groups around, specifically around early onset, right? Because early onset
Hmm.
Parkinson's looks different and has, you're having different challenges than the folks that get diagnosed later. But all those things kind of come together. And then being able to reframe what life looks like you said, the goals change, right? Your sources of joy change,
Hmm.
and being able to still honor yourself in that way, knowing that this is the thing, this is not what you are, right? Who you are is who you are, and then being able to move forward with what those new goals look like and as much support as you can find.
Well said. Well said. I think for me, I'm going to stay active. I feel like staying active really helps me deal with anxiety. When especially when I'm out there with my son and we're just balling and it's just like us having fun. Yeah, I'm not the guy I once was, but just being out there sweating and I leave there feeling like, man, I'm really glad I came out here. And sometimes I'm limping out or maybe my medication is wearing off and I'm walking kind of funny, but I'm not even thinking about that. I'm thought it's like, wow, I'm glad I got to enjoy this time with my son. He's growing up. Pretty soon he'll be off doing his own thing. And this is like precious time, and I still got to do it. So I still look at the bright side. I feel like having those coping skills, whether it's, going for a walk or, even playing video games, whatever it is you use to kind of help you deal with some of these side effects of the illness.
I mean, I think the reality is too, as you're talking about it, is that life goes on. Like life is still happening around you. And so being able to plug back in as much as you can, as much as you're able to, as much as you have the energy for, and all of that is
Hmm.
important. I think the bigger part for you too is, remember the doctor was like, I don't care what you do, like I want you to walk every day because we know that walking helps and it'll be, it's good for you and all that. So exercise is a huge thing, I think, for you especially.
Hmm.
But I think in general, right, we know that anxiety is relieved by some of these things. And the fact is that anxiety is also a byproduct of the disease. So being able to kind of deal with some of the mental health things that are happening because of this thing that's supposed to be a physical thing, is important too for you to recognize that it is anxiety. And sometimes it's anxiety outside of yourself to a certain extent, because we know that it just has to do with how the brain is working outside of whatever issues you might be having that day.
Hmm.
The physicality of it kind of pops up sometimes.
So yeah, I mean, I think this was a good discussion because grief, like you said, until we started designing this topic, I've only thought about grief as you lost someone, and that's kind of it. But like you said, like divorce, illness, you're still processing grief, and I'm gonna go look up the stages. I'm well informed. It's good to know what stage you're on.
Yeah, I mean, but like I said, I have an issue with the stages because they're not linear, and I think that so much has happened since they came out that I think definitely those are all feelings that you feel during grief,
Right. I
but
still
really
think,
it's more of a
yeah,
wave.
because I can pitch, I've been through those in my mind. I can denial, and then at some point you say, listen, some days I tell people I was pre-diagnosed with early onset, and then other times I'll say, I have this condition. So I don't know, maybe that's part of the grief. I don't know. I just thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, being able to tell someone what's going on is definitely part of it. A lot of times you can't name it until you accept it.
Hmm.
So that's a big part of it as well.
And sometimes you think, okay, I know positive thinking doesn't. I don't want to say it doesn't change things,
Hmm.
but I still think it's important to stay upbeat and positive about it while still working towards other things. Like for some reason, and call me kooky, or I just feel like at some point there will be something, some kind of change. Some kind of medication or something there that's going to be able to help me and other people. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Right. I mean, I think it's important, and a lot of that should be based on, like, there's a lot of research being done, right? There's a lot of different, and there are treatments, right? It's not it's not a cure, but there are treatments. And again, it looks different for everyone else. I always tell you this, like, there's a fine line, between just being positive and toxic positivity. So my issue is that it's making sure that you can be positive, but I want you to be positive having the data in front of you as well, because sometimes we can't ignore the facts and the things, the reality that we're living today. We can't ignore that for, like, whatever, positive message with, poster with a kitten on it we can find. So I think it's important too to remember that, because positivity is great. I think that it's gotten you through a lot. So I just want to name that, right? I know that having that positive mindset and being able to keep yourself in that state has been life saving for you, literally. But then opening up to some of the other realities while also practicing positivity is, I think, the best course of action as you're looking at what this looks like in, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely having a plan, a working plan. So yeah, so this was our episode on grief, grief and illness. Whether it be how you're dealing with your current reality, maybe you lost some functionalities of things that you were once able to do. Um, you know, uh, the main point here, as I'm saying, is definitely talk about it. Talk about it. We don't emphasize that enough. And we're going to stress that a team, build your team to have these discussions because um, I didn't really think I was dealing with grief until we named it. So,
Right.
any final thoughts?
Yeah, just that. And I mean, we'll be putting up, I did find some articles and things like that. So I'll try to get this up on the site. If you go to lovechronically.com, I will try to have a little resource list for each
Chronically.
episode. Um,
I said
Lord,
lovechronically.com.
you just messed up my whole flow of thinking.
I'm sorry.
But yeah, so we'll have some of the articles and just some helpful resources as we move along. But yeah, I think, and it's going to be something that comes up. I mean, we want to dedicate a topic on this, but I feel like every topic that we talk about is going to have to be, it's going to have to include grief just
Yeah.
because it's part of life and we shouldn't be afraid of it. We shouldn't be afraid of processing that grief. I know we are a death phobic society, but we also, I feel, are a grief phobic society because we don't want to always sit in our feelings. So
Y-
finding
y-
a support that can help with that.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, sometimes you feel like, what are people thinking? I know you really shouldn't care, but it does, it does come into play at some point. As much as you try to be an adult, it's not high school. How our peers see us is still a factor.
Absolutely.
And when you have an illness that's really visible, yeah, you're gonna have to find ways to kind of deal with that. You know,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So we'll have some resources on the site. If you have any questions, if anything comes up, any commentary, you know where to find us. We are Love Chronically everywhere. You can shoot us a message and let us know what you're thinking. At some point, we will have also like a form for you all to fill out on the site if you have a topic that you want us to
Right.
discuss, or if something's come up. Later on, we might be opening this up to some audience members so we can have some discussions. What? I've taken the horn away from you, so I know that you can't always clap. So here, his is for you. This is what I do for you. That's all you get.
Yeah. So she took
With
my
all,
DJ horn,
I didn't take it from you. Anyhow, it's a recording issue. I can't help it. I can't help it. It's not me. It's not
but we're
me.
working to get it back as expeditiously as we can.
You're working to get it back, yes. But this is our topic. We will be back later in a couple weeks with a new episode. But in the meantime, we hope you've enjoyed this episode and we look forward to talking a little bit more about this.
Until next time,
See
later.
ya.